Hey, it's Alex Williams of the New Stack, and today we're going to get a demo, and it's going to be conducted by Shannon Williams, co-founder of Rancher Labs, vice president of marketing and sales over there. He's going to give us an update on Rancher and the direction that it sees going, and now that we're coming into the conference season in Barcelona and into the rest of the year. So, Shannon, great to have you here.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks for having us. It's great to be here and great to chat with you as always. So
yeah. And who else do we have?
Yeah, I have our director of technical marketing, actually, Adrian Goins, on the phone with us. Adrian, you want to say hi to everybody?
Hello, everybody.
Hello, Adrian.
Adrian's been here at Rancher really for a long time now, a couple of years.
So. We were just saying how things have changed since 2015, but maybe really not at all.
Yeah, every day you figure like there's new things, and yet in so many ways they're just abstractions of things we've already done before, but they're getting consolidated and grouped together, and now they're easier to manage. And yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's a fun time to be working with Kubernetes and containers and Docker, but it has been for the last 4 years. It's been a blast.
All right, so give us an update. We'd love to see what you have here.
Sure. Yeah. So what we're going to be demoing today is Rancher 2.2. This is the latest Rancher release. For those who don't know, Rancher's it's an open source container management platform. It's really geared to running the management plane for all of your container environments across an organization. So really what it does is deploy and manage or import and manage any Kubernetes clusters. So what we're going to demo today is I'll show you a running environment that's got a bunch of clusters attached to it. We'll go through, maybe we'll spin up a cluster. We can create some workloads, kind of look at the difference between how an operator of the platform and a user of Kubernetes would interface with it. And we'll see. Hopefully everything will work.
Excellent.
So where we're starting, Alex, is at just sort of the login screen to a Rancher deployment. Rancher is software. So like I said, it's open source software. Everything's free. It's Apache licensed. You can use it to your heart's content. The question we always get then is, well, how do we stay in business? We sell support on this. So we have support agreements with customers on Rancher and all of our products. And so, today, Rancher's really grown a ton in popularity. I think we have about this time last year, we probably had about 8,000 daily active deployments where people were running, tens of thousands of clusters. Now we have about 25,000. So it's grown more than, about 200+% since last year. So it's been a really, really crazy year, kind of matching the growth of Kubernetes. As Kubernetes gets more popular, Rancher becomes more popular as a really nice way to manage it. So Rancher, because it's software, you usually install it either as a single container where you just deploy one Rancher node and it can run, or you can build an HA cluster of Rancher. It's just containers, and the backend is etcd. So you either run it as a Helm chart in a Kubernetes cluster if you want a highly available Rancher, or you can run a single node, just Docker run Rancher server, and that'll come up. So you can find all the information on how to get started on our website. But I'm just going to dive in and show you. So right off the bat, anyone accessing Rancher, we enforce access control. So I'm just logging in to this cluster that we have running in a data center. And what you would see as an admin when you first get to Rancher is all of the clusters that you're administering. So or if you're a user, you would see the clusters you have access to. So we have a really strong belief that Kubernetes is going to be quite ubiquitous. You're going to be running it in the cloud. You'll be running it on your development environments. You'll be running it in the data center. You'll be running it eventually out on the edge on devices, in factories and shops, and just about anywhere that you run IT managed infrastructure and IT managed services, you're going to be running Kubernetes in the next 5 to 6 years. And that's just because it adds so much value on top of Linux, and containers are such a great way to distribute software. And as we see more need for more complex software in different places, Kubernetes becomes more and more just a requisite to run the applications. And so we built Rancher with that expectation in mind, that you would be managing lots of clusters. And so Rancher really scales not just with the size of a single cluster, but also across hundreds or even thousands of clusters within an organization. So this deployment here has 5 different Kubernetes clusters that are under management. And the first thing you do when you set up Rancher is you turn on auth. And so you would come in and decide how you're going to manage users. And you might connect to GitHub, which is pretty common if you're setting up a team, or you'll connect it back to some enterprise LDAP or Active Directory or service for managing users. And this is going to be important because this is how you get the multi-tenancy. You say, okay, here's how we're going to manage users. And then once you've got that set up,
how do you manage your own authentication in your own architecture?
So we use GitHub, but we're actually moving everything to Active Directory. I think we've been using GitHub for a long time. In our next release, we've moved just everything in the company over to Active Directory. So we'll use that. It makes it easier for us when we remove when someone leaves or a new person's added, they just automatically get added to all the services. We can use roles to sort of define anyone who has this role on this team has access to this service, for example, or this cluster or this namespace or working group. So, what's really great about centralized auth is, we know who people are, we know the roles they have, and therefore we can give them access to the right things. And Kubernetes gives us a lot of primitives here. We can build really nice individual roles for users in terms of what they're allowed to do. And you can customize these, you can deploy, build roles that apply at the global level, but you can also build cluster or project level. You can, define these in a lot of detail. So you can come in and, define very specific concepts of what a user is allowed to do at different levels of the platform. And that becomes important because, we're not just doing one cluster and then giving a namespace to a user. That user is probably going to have access to multiple clusters. They're probably going to have access to dev and staging environments. They may be running multiple projects, and we want to create a very much a Kubernetes as a service experience. So as a user, we want them to be able to come in and get access to what they need to do their job. So I see now in this place, I've got 5 clusters, but often one of the first things we'll do is launch our first cluster. And so when you go to add a cluster, you're able to, you really have sort of 4 options for what a new Kubernetes cluster that Rancher is going to manage looks like. And it really reflects our view that Kubernetes is going to be everywhere, and you're going to want to have a lot of flexibility in how you manage it. Because, when you're in the cloud, it makes a lot of sense to use hosted Kubernetes services like Google's GKE or Amazon EKS. And in this case, I would just, if I needed a new cluster, maybe I just want to run a cluster for a short period of time or for a specific group or maybe in a specific part of the world, I would use my credentials on Amazon to actually, create that cluster, define again who's going to be able to access it, and as soon as I did that, I'd have a new cluster within Rancher that I could start exposing to users and allowing them to consume. You can also import a cluster. So in this case, we're using the hosted Kubernetes that the cloud provider is managing. In the imported case, it's really more, Alex, like say you maybe acquired a company or a team inside used kubeadm to spin up a cluster, or they deployed their own cluster a couple of years ago and it's been under management for a while, and maybe someone's got OpenShift or something else that has a Kubernetes endpoint. Any Kubernetes cluster can be imported into Rancher. So Rancher can, bring it into the global visibility of the team managing Kubernetes. And this is really cool when you start doing things like, now I want to push a set of security policies across all my clusters, or I want to deploy a tool like a security product, like say Aqua or Twistlock. I want that on every node, or a monitoring tool like Sysdig or Datadog. You build, as you kind of bring all the clusters together, it becomes really easy to deploy apps across everything. So in both these import or hosted clusters, the management of Kubernetes is actually done by someone besides Rancher in terms of like when I upgrade or how I deployed it, how I scale it. But we can also do that for you. In that case, Rancher can actually manage the provisioning of infrastructure. So we have, dozens of drivers to different types of platforms like vSphere or OpenStack or Amazon or Azure, where you can actually use your credentials on one of these clouds and define exactly the version and type of Kubernetes. And in that case, Rancher will actually deploy and manage that Kubernetes going forward for you. So we'll upgrade it. We'll actually maintain its health. We'll back up the etc.
Which infrastructure providers are getting the most interest, or are being used the most?
Really, the biggest ones are Amazon and vSphere, I would say, with Azure right behind it. So we see a lot of Amazon, Azure, vSphere for this. Well, most of the people running in Google are using GKE. A lot of people in Amazon are deploying their own clusters. Some are using EKS. So it just depends on the provider. DigitalOcean is really popular with a lot of our users. We see OpenStack in some accounts being a really nice way to manage OpenStack. So it kind of depends. There's also this approach called custom, and custom is actually really popular because it allows you to, instead of Rancher going and provisioning the host and then installing, it allows you to provision the host and then install, and Rancher will automatically deploy Kubernetes to it and maintain Kubernetes for you. So, for example, in custom, you would say you might use Terraform to build the hosts, or an auto-scaling group in Amazon to build the host. And then you would define, again, who's going to have access to the cluster, give it a name. You'd pick the type of version. So, we usually support, the latest Kubernetes right away. So as soon as a new Kubernetes comes out, there'll be a new implementation of that. And, we'll deploy that. We'll allow them to configure the Kubernetes. So all of this stuff we're showing, I'm kind of showing the UI version of it, but it's all available through the API or the CLI of Rancher 2. The definition of a Kubernetes cluster is just a YAML file. You can extend the whole thing out and build it to yourself to, exactly how you want Kubernetes operated and deployed, what kind of policies you want to enforce on it, how you want to do backup of etcd. So there's a lot of configuration that we allow you to do when you're deploying Kubernetes, whether you use one of these drivers that will automatically provision hosts, or you provision the host yourself.
So what's your direction? So what's your direction that you're taking with the platform?
Really, it's all about supporting, trying to be really flexible in terms of what does Kubernetes, look like in a given company. And that is based on an expectation that Kubernetes is going to become, it's very standardized. There's this great certification that the CNCF enables so that we can easily manage any Kubernetes as long as it follows, core certification. And so, there's really no preference. In the cloud, we tend to recommend people use, the cloud provided Kubernetes. It's great. They're really easy to deploy. They're managed by the cloud provider. It takes some of the administrative burden off of anyone having to worry about monitoring the health of that Kubernetes backplane. On premise, obviously, it's more often that they're running on VMware or bare metal or OpenStack. And so, we just want to be really flexible in terms of how you deploy these clusters, and then add a lot of value around them so that people can do a lot with it.
So go ahead. So that would then reason why the custom approach is popular.
Absolutely. All of these are, all of this flexibility, the flexibility applies everywhere. The custom approach is popular because, teams have a lot of automation tools, and automation tools make it really nice when you want to, kind of define your cluster, but then have, let's say we were deploying a new stack environment, and we authorize the team to come in here. We're going to use this version of Kubernetes with Canal as the orchestrator. We're not going to do any cloud providers. I'm not going to configure anything else. What Rancher would turn out is they would allow me to kind of configure what I need on the nodes. So I need a worker node, for example. Or let's start with probably wanting to do an etcd node. And basically we give you a Docker run command that's going to deploy our agent, tell it to call back to the management server, give it the token that says it's authorized to actually be connecting. And then we'll know that this is a new etcd server for the new stack cluster, and we'll start installing etcd on this. And if you add another one or a third one, we'll cluster that etcd. And then you might run a separate one to deploy the control plane, or a third one to deploy a bunch of workers. So you can build a quite robust approach and automate, deploying all of these clusters. The same process, if I was doing it through, say, VMware, I would actually create a node template within VMware, and that node template would include, my credentials, for example, to the vSphere server to provision VMs, or to EC2 to provision VMs. So the provisioning of clusters is really cool. It's nice and easy. You can see when you kind of start the process, it'll sit in a provisioning state. This is waiting for us to go run and deploy that agent out onto a host and have it reconnect, and then this would show up as a new cluster. And clusters are easily deployed. You can, once you've got them, you can back them up. You can restore from an old backup. You can rotate the certs. You can delete it if you don't need it anymore. And you can see that in any of these clusters. But before I move into an individual cluster, I want to show you, kind of the stuff you do at a global level, because this is where you define things like auth. You set up global pod security policies. You can create policies, of varying levels of complexity. And, as you define those, they'll build out new security policies that you can apply at either the cluster or even just a namespace level to a group. So you centralize it, you build the policies once, and then you apply them to all your clusters. We do the same thing for things like catalogs. If you want to run Helm catalogs for global Helm catalogs, you can do that as the administrator and say, here is my company's catalog of applications. We're going to connect to a Git repo where we keep all of our charts, and we'll make it very easy for people to connect that up and then start to serve those to their users. And that will be available across, if you make it global, it'll be available across every cluster. But you could also allow teams to run them at the cluster level or even just a project level. So if I just have access to part of a cluster, a group of namespaces, I can run them. So catalogs become a really important part of how applications get managed. It's also where you would manage things like, if you wanted to do applications that get deployed across multiple clusters, you use things like global DNS providers. So if I want to, connect Rancher with something like Amazon Route 53 or Cloudflare or any other DNS provider, you can connect there. And that allows you to do really cool stuff when you're deploying applications across clusters.
Right.
So again, this is something you would do more as an administrator or a user who had multi-cluster access. You could then deploy things that would work on 2 or 3 clusters. So for example, if I wanted to launch an application, but make that application, not just deploy to a single, Kubernetes cluster, but actually deploy to multiple clusters, like say my Datadog agent. I could come in, configure, my Datadog service, provide my actual, inside of Datadog, I would provide all of my configuration, my API key and things like that. But one of the choices I would have would be, which projects and services do I want to deploy this on? So which clusters, I want to deploy this to all of my clusters or multiple clusters across multiple services. You can kind of choose how to deploy this so that you can do, really nice centralized management of agents and applications that are deployed in multiple places across multiple hosts. So all that is kind of happening at the global level. We're managing, kind of widely deployed applications, users, access policies, security settings, and the lifecycle of all of these, all that day 2 type of stuff people talk about is what gets handled at the cluster level. As a user, most of your time is actually spent, working on the clusters you have access to. So as a user, I might see that I have access to, for example, this EKS cluster. And so within this EKS cluster, I would come in and see, oh, here's my EKS cluster. It's been provisioned for me. And I might have the whole cluster. So if we were doing something like clusters as a service for teams, we might provision a whole cluster for them, give them administrative privilege for a cluster, which can be really useful because, whereas a namespace, I can just provision containers and deploy workloads. At a cluster, I can do a lot of, I can actually do CRDs and I can, configure global services in that cluster like Istio and other things that are hard to install as just a namespace. You can actually do them at a cluster-wide service. So as a user or an admin for a cluster, I would be able to get my kubeconfig file and then just start talking directly to kubectl, or I could dive into the UI and start, managing this service. You can see this service, we've got it launched. I think this cluster, we already turned monitoring on. So one of the cool things in Rancher is we have, we while we use Kubernetes as the basis, we also put a lot of the rest of the CNCF stack around it. So we implement Prometheus and FluentD, all these things in what we call tooling. So a user can come in and say, oh, I want monitoring on this cluster. I'm going to turn on monitoring. This has already been enabled, but I would configure Prometheus, deploy it by hitting save. And then all of a sudden, if I've just imported a cluster, now I'm going to start seeing a whole bunch of cluster metrics here. Mm-hmm. And these are going to be defined by what's happening there. I can click on anything and it'll take me to Grafana and I can sort of see what's going on there at that level. I can dive into the individual nodes and sort of look at individual nodes and get data back for these specific nodes in terms of what's happening at the node level. So there's just a lot of management capabilities you get as a user or a cluster admin. This is also where you deal with things like, deploying storage for your cluster, managing, say logging at a cluster-wide level. We implement FluentD and you can, connect it to any service. You might set up notifiers and alerts. So if you want to connect this cluster to Slack or PagerDuty or any other webhook, you could create these notifiers and then set alerts that would work. And all these services I'm showing you, they work both at the the administrator level for a cluster, but also at the single project level. So a project user. So here you can see a bunch of alerts that have been created, and I can configure which notifiers I would want these alerts to talk to. I had some notifiers set
So
up there.
what we're looking at, so like, for instance, you have a set of alerts for etcd, a set of alerts for Q components, and you can add alert rules to each one or to the set of them. I mean, so how does it work for adding rules?
Yeah, you basically can create groups of rules. So if you want to set a bunch of rules, you can then manage them as a group. Where I say, okay, I don't want some of these to be activated. I can delete them or manage them. And then a rule is really based on all sorts of different things. You can monitor based on activities and notifications that are happening at the Kubernetes alerting level, like just the what's happening in Kubernetes, like a service is healthy or a service is unhealthy. If I've got Prometheus turned on, I would be able to set up a bunch of services, a bunch of alerts based on, say, metrics being passed or anything like that. And then those things are called notifiers. So
that seems to be the fascinating part of Kubernetes. Is that for you, Adrian? Part of the fascination that you find with it? I mean, you'd be able to like configure services very quickly. It's a change, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I come out of the data center infrastructure world, and Kubernetes lets me do things that used to require switches and routers and configurable, just this whole other layer of physical infrastructure. And now it's nothing to just spin things up, move them around. The portability is fantastic.
So how do you see it reflected in, in how you're using it, and how is it changing your own approaches? Or how has it in the past? What do you see?
Ooh, the speed at which we're able to do things it's phenomenal. Whether it's in prototyping stuff, testing stuff, bringing equipment or bringing container images down, testing out new things, or whether it's rolling stuff out into production, scaling things up and down, moving between providers, just the flexibility that Kubernetes provides opens doors that just we couldn't access before.
I mean, one of the coolest things, Alex, is just, as this becomes more and more ubiquitous, right? I mean, what we're showing here is, from a single set of policies, a single API, effectively, I can, talk to all sorts of different kinds of infrastructure with a really high degree of confidence that whatever I deploy there is going to work. It's going to work as I expected it to. I mean, I've got basically now the container gave me sort of immutable code, right? The code that the developer wrote and all the dependencies they had would be packaged and shipped to me. And so I had the container. Now we have sort of the same thing for the operations. Kubernetes gives me like immutable operations. Everything I'm showing and defining is all defined as code as well. And it's all can be, managed through a GitOps type of flow. So, now you take that and apply it globally everywhere. And things like, how would I update the software in every retail location across thousands of stores, becomes quite achievable, like quite realistic and very relatively easy for me to do. And so you see the standardization combined with kind of immutable, development, immutable or packaging of software plus immutable operations. And you can get reliability everywhere. You can bring security with you wherever you go. I mean, that's what's transformative about all of this.
That's what essentially you're building into the 2.2. Isn't that? Is that?
I mean, that's a lot of that's just the nature of everything we're doing. But what 2.2 is so good at is managing it globally, taking it and really taking all those concepts and making them very usable, easy for people to kind of manage and control. It's like, it's great to have all these clusters. It's even better when you can dive into the clusters and manage, all your nodes centrally and start to, expose this to more and more people in an organization. Once we have one of these clusters exposed, we're creating these projects for teams, right? So, you got Alex's lab, authorizing Alex to have access to it. And, you can give them some limits on how much he's allowed to do and some quotas. But from there, he really has effectively, like Adrian said, almost like a virtual data center now that he can go and work in, right? And so Alex, when he joined, would see something like this, like, here's the cluster you're in. It's, it's in EKS, so it's in Amazon US West. Go to town. You can provision whatever you want. You can create load balancers and manage volumes and, connect it to your pipelines. And, all this stuff just gets really self-service, really easy to create, easy to test, easy to then run in production, easy to upgrade.
Adrian, it's so easy for these new guys, isn't it?
Well, we can joke about back in our day, we used to have to do whatever. The fact that these tools exist is fantastic. But the reality of the situation is that people are going in to use tools like this without the background and the understanding, yet they still need to be able to do things reliably. And that's one of the things that I find most powerful about Rancher is it gives them access to the power of something like Kubernetes in a safe way. They don't have to spend a year learning how to do all of these things or run the risks of making mistakes when they're being thrown into production environments. We give them a safe environment in which to work. We give them all of the security. And as they want to learn more about Kubernetes, none of it's hidden. They can just peel back the covers a little bit and all of the Kubernetes is right there for them to interact with directly if that's what they want to do.
That's a big part of it, Alex. Like one of the things is there for, I think if I look today versus 4 years ago, it's just gotten better and better is, there's very little like obfuscating of the underlying APIs. Like people are now, really almost like they want the developer to be uninhibited, right? Or the DevOps person to be uninhibited. And so you really are, this is where I think there's a big shift from traditional PaaS projects, the Herokus and the Cloud Foundries and tools like that were kind of geared around, here's how you should build your app. And we'll give you all of the best ways to write 12-factor. And I think those things were really good, but they always kind of came at a big cost where you couldn't just get down to the underlying components and do whatever you need to do as you learned more or as your application requirements got more complex over time. That's what's so great about Kubernetes is that all of that stuff is there, but you don't necessarily need to use it off the bat. I mean, we can just go and deploy a simple service. Let's say we just want to bring up, a little Nginx environment. And, for example, one of the first things we decide is, well, what kind of service do you want to deploy in Kubernetes? Does you want to just deploy a single pod? Or do we want to make this a daemon set? Do we want to run 5 pods, or should it have a volume attached to it? So we try to help people understand the different options that exist. Give them access to their applications. We'll create this new namespace called Nginx in Alex's environment. Because we're going to expose this somewhere, we actually need to put it on a port. So we'll put this on port 80. And then we'll, there's a lot more that we could do, like setting up health checks and stuff, but it's all kind of hidden by default unless you want to drop in and do, more complex scheduling of these services, or you want to do some storage attached to it, or you want to set some auto scaling, for example, or, define an upgrade policy for it. Like those things are there and they're all available to you. And it goes even further, right? You can go even deeper into, what's possible within Kubernetes. But you start with just the basics so that anybody can understand, okay, how do I deploy a single service? And so this one is now, it's in the updating, deploying stage. It's going out looking for capacity. And now, my pod is up. And under the covers, all we're doing is creating YAML files, right? We're creating Kubernetes YAML. So if I click here, I can actually see that YAML that was created. And if I want to change something like, I don't want 1 anymore, but I want 3 nodes, I can edit this, I can download it, I can edit it all through Git and push it. But I can modify and deploy these services and set them up the way I would want them to actually go, and create them where I need them and how I need them. So all of the details are in there. The actual containers are visible. You can dive into it and see what's going on. You can turn on Prometheus on all this stuff. But it really just is about making it easy to provision and deploy stuff, and then pull out what you need to repeat it if you need to.
So when you look at how you're going to evolve, and especially when we see more teams adopt Kubernetes and adopt the workflows that go with Kubernetes, what will you be looking for, in your own architectural development? What are some of those things you're looking out?
Well, there's a bunch of things that are on our 2.3 release cycle that we're working on right now that are going to push towards the future. One of them is, most of the implementation of service mesh in all this stuff adds another level of complexity typically. And so, we've had Istio in the catalog for a long time where users would come in and deploy Istio as part of their cluster. But like Prometheus, we had it there. What becomes really valuable is when you actually incorporate it into the user experience. And so in our next release, you'll see Istio become part of this entire UI. And so, it'll be like one of our toolings. So you'll be able to come and just say, turn on Service Mesh. And then Service Mesh will not just be implemented and it'll be Istio and you'll have the API if you want to use it, but it'll be incorporated into the entire user experience so that when they go to deploy a workload, they might be asked, well, would you like to scale this when the number of sessions on a host it hits 12 or 20 or 50 or whatever. And that's possible because Istio knows about HTTP traffic and understands how many sessions are calling to a specific container and can do things that Prometheus, as good as it is, can't tell. Prometheus could tell more that, how much RAM is this service taking up and how much CPU is it consuming, and then we should scale it. Now you move to doing things that way. And then Istio opens up all sorts of other cool things like how to do live traffic, blending. So if I run two versions of the same service, maybe current and the new version that I'm about to roll out, it becomes really easy to adjust. So let me
ask a question. So how do you avoid proxy madness? Because, you could start building meshes on meshes on meshes.
That's a great question. I think right now the key is actually starting to get to what the user needs to configure. Like I think one of the things we've been working on for a while now is trying to understand not just Istio, because that's true for Istio, but it's also true for how the CI interfaces with the actual platform and how things like Prometheus are consumed, where the complexity of the stack gets really high. I think in the most recent CNCF survey, the number one challenge people were facing was the complexity. It's just there's too much complexity within the cloud native stack for people to understand all of what's possible, and then to train the development teams and the DevOps teams and the SREs how to use it. And so, for us as a provider of a platform, what our challenge is to, without taking away all the functionality, to provide really easy paths for people to understand what's possible, and to be able to go down those paths, but leave them with the ability to get as complex as they want. But that's where, having people like Adrian and Darren on our team who use this stuff every day, they have really good insights into what a great user experience is going to be like on specific things.
So
that's the magic.
Yeah, Adrian, I was just going to ask you about that. Like, what's the fascination part for the job and you when it gets to this point? Because it does get into some levels of abstraction. You need to kind of continually get more granular and find those patterns, don't you?
Sorry, I didn't follow the question. What keeps me excited about the job?
I'm just trying to think about ask about how you think about continuing to create this environment that makes it the ability to get more granular kind of in the data that you can find patterns about. Because as you start to add more services, as you start to add service meshes, you are starting to deal with a lot more data volume, but also monitoring capabilities and such. And so I'm just curious from your perspective how that kind of plays into your thinking.
So I'm not directly involved in the decisions about what to implement in the product. There are other people that make those decisions. What I've seen from the choices that they make are that obviously we want to avoid complexity, yet we want to enable flexibility and functionality and give people the ability to do the things that they need to do. If you imagine that you're on one side of a field and you're trying to get to the other side, and there's an infinite number of paths through it, there are some paths that are the right intersection of all of those previous things. And Rancher's engineering department does an excellent job of establishing those paths, giving you a sane set of defaults and a sane direction in which to go, while still also saying, what if you want to deploy 17 Istios on top of each other and totally destroy things? You can go ahead and do that, because we're not here to tell you what not to do.
Right, exactly.
We're just here to give you the best path forward.
That's a good corollary. I like that.
So, Alex, we've covered a lot. Really under the covers, so much of this is about how organizations enable developers, give them a lot of guide rails and things like that to make it easy in cases where it's important to enforce policies like pod security policies or access control. They can easily do those things, network policies like that. But for the most part, I think the reason people, so many people love Rancher is it really does kind of find that balance between an organization needing to wanting to make this stuff available, but also users wanting to have a ton of flexibility, wanting to just have native Kubernetes and really Kubernetes everywhere. I think that so much of what we're seeing is a move to, let me really take all of these great ideas we're seeing come out of the community and the cloud native, foundation and everything else, and push them into the places that they would actually impact our business. And if our business is, if we're in retail, there's some of the most interesting things we can be doing right now are actually what we do at the store and how we change the user experience when they walk in. And if we're a company that does cruises, right? We're working with one of the big cruise companies, and they're putting Kubernetes on every cruise ship. We're working with military organizations around the world that are using this to distribute software to all sorts of different platforms out in the field. So I think we talk about edge, and people kind of think of the ring and on their doorbell, but the real change was all this stuff that isn't data center is going to behave a lot more like data center when it's actually Kubernetes out there, and that's exciting.
Adrian, any last thoughts about that you have? We're going into KubeCon coming up. What's on your mind? What are you thinking about? What are some of the advancements in kind of Kubernetes architectures and such that you're curious about as you follow kind of your own communities?
Yeah, I'm not sure that. So I unfortunately, KubeCon's in Europe. I live in South America, so I'm not going to this KubeCon. But having been to KubeCon last year, having been to DockerCon, the thing that I'm most excited about is not so much about the technology or the developments within the Kubernetes ecosystem, but it's really the overall adoption of Kubernetes. We're seeing everything from established players, large companies, big organizations that are rolling this out, all the way down to people who are just still curious about it. Mm-hmm. When I do a weekly training for Rancher on Kubernetes, and so I deal with a lot of people who are just beginning their Kubernetes journey, and I try to explain that Kubernetes it's like electricity. Like it's something that is a commodity, but is so immensely valuable that I'm simply excited by talking to new people and getting more people to use it everywhere. I run Kubernetes in my house. I think people should run Kubernetes any place possible that they can get benefit from a container infrastructure. And that's a lot more places than people think.
Well, I'm going to start configuring the house down, starting here at Studio B. Maybe I need to start thinking about Kubernetes down
you can run it on a Raspberry Pi.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool. It's anywhere you need to run software. That's what's cool. One of the things, Alex, I would say too, is if people watch this and they want to get started and try it out,
sure.
There's a really great Slack channel. If you just want to click inside of Rancher, you can click on, if you just slack.rancher.io, there's literally almost 10,000 people in there. There's always hundreds of people who can help you, can answer questions. It is a really amazing community. The other really great thing is the Kubernetes Slack. If you haven't joined that already, that's a great Slack as well. And there's a Rancher channel in there as well, which is also really rich and full of people. So a lot of places to get going. You can figure out how to deploy and download all this if you just go to rancher.com and click on deploy right here. It's super easy. It'll show you how, like I said at the beginning, it's all open source, really easy to get started and easy to set up and run.
Well, Shannon, thank you so much for showing Rancher in Rancher 2.2. And Adrian, thank you so much for joining and adding your perspectives. I really enjoyed it. So look forward to
pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Yeah. We'll talk to you guys soon.
Take care, Alex. Great to see you.
You too.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.